Firing days up through the links. My next move up the links was in 1964 into number 2 link, and Alan Ackhurst became my regular driver. We had quite an assortment of turns, mainly freight and ballast trains, but also some passenger work. Alan would be my regular driver for the next 18 months, and although we got on quite well, it would be untruthful if I was to tell you that working with Alan as a regular mate was a bed of roses, as he could be moody and was at times quite cantankerous. Alan was renowned to be a bit heavy-handed with the use of the regulator, and I sometimes found it difficult to keep up with him, for as soon as I'd finished shovelling coal into the firebox, Alan would do his utmost to burn it, some exiting the chimney with a display of rockets the size of Jaffa oranges. However, I do have some very fond memories of Alan. One of the early turns in number 2 link involved working a freight train to Petersfield, calling it at various station sidings on the way there and the way back. We would call in at Haslemere first and drop off the coal wagons, and then go to Liphook with military wagons that were destined for Longmoor Camp. Once we'd shunted there, we'd miss Liss on the down trip and then call in at Petersfield. One of the sidings was on the down side just before the station. This was originally the Midhurst branch, and there used to be a factory there called Itside Rubber Company Limited, where they manufactured commando heels and soles for their range of army boots. After shunting duties were completed, it was customary for the fireman to make the tea, and we'd all take refreshment in the guard's van. After finishing our brief sojourn, Alan and I made our way back to the locomotive, and as we did so, I picked up one of the reject rubber heels that were strewn along the track. Alan was a good distance ahead of me, and I jokingly threw it towards him. Unfortunately, the rubber heel's flight path took upon a mind of its own, curling somewhat similar to a frisbee, hitting Alan by the side of the ear. I could see that Alan wasn't amused, so I decided to wait a while before climbing up the steps to the engine, thinking that he might have calmed down by then and see the funny side of it. As I climbed up the steps, I unwittingly placed my half-full tea can onto the footplate, and as I climbed the handrails, Alan picked up the tea can and proceeded to tip the tea and grouts, no tea bags in those days, all over my head. I wasn't wearing my hat or knotted handkerchief at that time, so my hair, yes I had some then, was covered in tea and grouts. It served me right to play such a foolish prank, and this was Alan's revenge for hitting him with the rubber heel. I was combing tea grouts out from my hair all the way back to Guildford. Another early turn we had was to sign on at around 3 AM and take a BR Standard Class 5 MT locomotive light to Woking. When the 3:40 AM paper train arrived from Waterloo, the train would be split and you'd work the rear portion of the train to Portsmouth and Southsea, low-level station. After stopping at Guildford to unload papers, the next stop would be Godalming. I always went back to make the tea at Godalming, and on a Tuesday, the newspaper proprietor would always let me have a copy of the Angling Times and the Angler's Mail without having to pay for them. Our next stop would be Haslemere, and then on to Petersfield, and it was here that we pick up the water churns and load them onto the footplate to be deposited at the foot crossing at Ditcham, as the railway house there didn't have a running water supply. As well as dropping off the water churns, you'd also be expected to pick up the empty ones, and these would be dropped off at Havant and subsequently returned to Petersfield for refilling. Once you'd reached your destination at Portsmouth and Southsea station, you would then have to wait about an hour for your train to be released. You then run light to Fratton Motor Power Depot, where you would perform the necessary disposal duties before returning back to Guildford on the cushions. Godalming Goods Yard was still open whilst I was Alan's fireman, and we had the honour of working the last official freight train there. After shunting had been completed, we'd go to a small shunter's room and have our tea. The resident shunter was Samuel Sapsard, who also had a part-time job as an undertaker's assistant, pallbearer, and he'd have us in stitches with his tails. Our guard on the last official day was Jack Prescott from Woking, and I remember him inscribing on the wall, "Last train to Godalming Goods," with the date, and to finish, "Jack Prescott made the tea." On the return trip to Guildford Yard, it was sometimes necessary to call into Artington sidings via a ground frame on the up line between Farncombe and Guildford at Peasmarsh. There was a huge brick cold store on the site, which was built at the beginning of the Second World War for emergency food storage, mostly tin corned beef. Other coal stores of similar design were built all around the country, one of which was at Froyle, situated between Bentley and Alton stations. As previously mentioned, paydays were on a Thursday, and to give you an idea of how much you would be paid for the previous week's work, pay slips were issued to you on the Wednesday by the non-clerical timekeeper. Here's a pay slip showing, in this case, various rates of pay depending on which capacity you were working, example, as a fireman or driver. Note that all the calculations were performed by hand, no computers in those days. There would always be a gathering of men around the area of the pay table on Guildford Station's Platform 2. Other railway personnel, such as platform staff, signalmen, etc., were also paid there. Others usually present would be an ASLEF union representative and someone else selling useless Eustace tickets for sixpence. In fact, anyone to persuade you to hand over your hard-earned cash. The first time I'd ever seen a locomotive speedo go round to 100 mile an hour was with Alan, whilst working a van train from Haslemere to Guildford, and Alan decided to see how fast we could go down Haslemere Bank. We were on a BR Standard Class 5 MT locomotive that evening, and I managed to photograph the speedo as the needle reached the magic ton. We nearly came to a sticky end though, as the semaphore distance signal for Whitley was in the caution position, and it was all hands to the pumps to stop. I didn't particularly like working nights, as in the summer months it wasn't easy to get a good sleep in the daytime. However, the very early turns were even worse, and when I look back, my mum and dad were absolutely brilliant in helping me get up in the mornings. My bed was situated next to the wall that adjoined their bedroom, so apart from having my Big Ben alarm clock, my dad would set his alarm on their Goblin Teas maid as a second alarm, and would knock on the wall to ensure I was awake. They would also want to know that I was back home safely when coming off a late turn, and getting home between 1 AM and 6 AM. I'm indebted to them both for their incredible patience, as shift work can be, and invariably did, make me very irritable. I expect they were quite glad when I got married, but that wasn't until after steam had finished. During 1964, the drum and tanks were phased out and replaced by Ivat Class 2 MT locomotives that originally worked on the London Midland region. They were excellent workhorses and ideal for the Guildford to Horsham line services. They all steam well and the cabs were very comfortable. We had a couple of turns where we worked over the Horsham line, a freight, which I never did work as a fireman, and an evening passenger service which I really enjoyed. The only thing that I wasn't keen on was the exchange of staffs at each single line section. These were nearly always completed on the move, to save stopping, and as Alan was a bit of a speed merchant, the exchange of staffs nearly broke my wrists as I'd let go of one staff and grasp the next one. The entry point to the line to Horsham was at Peasmarsh Junction, and this was where the first staff was collected. This allowed permission for your train to travel on the single line section to Bramley and Wanhurst station, where there was a passing loop. The staff was then given up and another was collected which allowed permission to travel through the single line section from Bramley and Wanhurst station to Cranley. Cranley was quite a busy station, boasting to be, at the time, the largest village in England. As you ran into Cranley, you would exchange staffs again, this time for the section between Cranley and Baynards. Sometimes you would be held at Cranley for a train from Baynards to enter the passing loop before the next start was issued, and once the signal was cleared, this would be your authority to enter the single line section to Baynards. Baynards station prided itself on its fantastic dahlia flower beds. The station master, Geoff Burch, won a prize for the best display of dahlias on the railway line. He had around 1,000 dahlias of 240 different varieties, which were grown in flower beds behind the platforms. After exchanging staffs again, you would then go forward to Rudgwick Station, but not before passing through Baynard's Tunnel, which was the highest point along the line, 250 feet above sea level and 330 yards long. The tunnel was very narrow, and before entering, it was customary for you to place a handkerchief around your mouth to avoid inhaling the smoke and fumes. The block sections between Rudgwick and Slinfold to Christ's Hospital were normally switched out, so the staff that was collected at Baynard's was given up at the end of the single line at Christ's Hospital. From here, you joined the main line from Brighton and travelled on the up line to Horsham. You didn't have a lot of time to spare at Horsham, so as soon as the shunter had uncoupled the train, you moved up to the end of the platform to replenish the side tanks with water before running round the train and returning to Guildford. The next series of photographs show the return service to Guildford, calling it Christ's Hospital, Slinfold, Rudgwick, Baynard's, Cranley and Bramley and Wonersh. The final single line staff would be given up at Peasmarsh Junction before joining the main Portsmouth to Guildford line. Once reaching Guildford, the process would repeat itself for the next journey back to Horsham. A sad day for all concerned as Ivet Class 2MT 41287 prepares to leave Guildford with a 7:34 p.m. to Horsham on Saturday the 12th of June 1965. This was to be the last scheduled passenger service to Horsham before the line's closure. Two Guildford fitters witnessed the last passenger service to Horsham as the train passes Guildford Shed. A fortunate female passenger has the honour of riding on the footplate. The following day, a special train was chartered to run over the line for the last time. Here we see Q1 Class 33006 and Q1 Class 33027 whilst at a photographic stop at Baynard's. The locomotives headed the final leg of the LCGB Weldesman Rail Tour from Horsham to Waterloo via Cranley and Guildford. The crew were all Guildford men, driver Jock Miles and fireman Bill Moore, and driver Doug Stent and fireman Dave Newbury. Dave Salmon took this shot of the two locomotives about to charge through London Road station on their way to Waterloo via Cobham. Suddenly though, the train came to an abrupt halt by the guard placing his brake valve to the emergency position. The reason being that the train crew had forgot to stop at Guildford for some of its passengers to alight. On Christmas Eve 1964, Alan and I were booked to work a relief train from Waterloo to Bournemouth, getting relief at Southampton. We were booked to go past the Nine Elms and prepare our own locomotive, and then go light to Waterloo to join up with their train. The locomotive was a rebuilt West Country class, and when we reached Waterloo to couple up our train, I jumped down to perform the necessary task. First, coupling up the steam heating pipes before Alan eased up for the coupling to be hooked on, and then the vacuum pipes. As mentioned, it was Christmas Eve, so I turned on the steam heating cock to allow the train to be heated. Away we went from Waterloo, and our first stop was Winchester. We didn't have a particularly good trip as I remember, and when we stopped at Winchester, the guard came up to the cab and said that the train was freezing cold. I exclaimed, "Well, it's not up here, I've been sweating all the way down." It was then that we both realised that I hadn't opened the angle cocks between the locomotive's tender and the end coach to allow the steam through to heat the train. After finishing work after one early turn, I was riding my motorcycle along Markenfield Road in Guildford when I either hit a brick or another obstacle in the road and was thrown over the handlebars, landing on my head. Luckily, no other traffic was around and I was also wearing a crash helmet. I remember being taken to the Royal Surrey Hospital at Farnham Road by a passing motorist. The nurse was asking me my details, and although I remembered my name, I must have been suffering from concussion, as I couldn't for the life of me remember how old I was. It wasn't until my dad arrived at the hospital that I found out, when I asked him my date of birth. I had to have some stitches in my face, and it looked as if I'd been a few rounds in the boxing match with Cassius Clay. When I got home, my younger sister Jane, who was only 4 years old, was frightened to come into the room and called me Bleedy Eye. Another regular turn that we had at Guildford was to go past to Nine Elms on a Sunday evening and prepare the locomotive, normally a BR Standard Class 3 MT tank, and then go light to Clapham Yard and work the milk train to Vauxhall. This particular evening we arrived at Nine Elms and went out to our locomotive, only to find that one of the shed washout plugs on the boiler front was leaking quite badly. Alan went and told the running foreman, and with that the foreman climbed up onto the footplate with a huge box spanner and, standing in front of the washout plug, commenced to tighten it up. I was off the footplate like a jackrabbit, but he didn't see the obvious dangers should the plug become cross-threaded. Anyway, he managed to tighten the plug, and once we'd prepared the locomotive, we went on our way to Clapham Yard. The milk train consisted of about 6 milk tanks, and after you left Clapham Yard, you would be routed via the Up Windsor through line to Vauxhall. Once the tanks had been positioned, it was just a case of waiting until the first couple of milk tanks had been emptied, and the train was then repositioned to empty the next tank. It was usually a long night doing nothing, and in the summer months I'd lie on one of the platform benches and try to get some sleep. On the Monday morning you were normally booked relief at Vauxhall by a Nine Elms crew, but sometimes, if all the milk tanks had been emptied, you would work the train into Waterloo and get relief there. After working any train to Salisbury, it was customary to have a walk down to the town, or should I say city, as Salisbury has a splendid cathedral. As we walked down Fisherton Street, I happened to see a very rare motorcycle parked in one of the shop fronts. It was a Brough Superior, the mark made famous by T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, who owned 7 of them. Unfortunately, he was fatally injured when he was thrown from one of them at high speed in 1935. On another day at Salisbury, Alan went to see the running foreman to find out what locomotive we had to prepare for our return trip, the 5:15 p.m. passenger service from Salisbury to Waterloo, getting relief at Woking. The locomotive allotted to us was a BR Standard Class 5 MT and had a similar number, the last 3 numerals, to an original West Country class standing in the next road. Alan said, "We'll prepare the West Country class, and if anyone says anything, I'll say that I misheard." I started to make the fire up, and as I remember that the contender was full of hard black Yorkshire coal which burnt like paper. As we were finalising preparation, the running foreman came out and told us that we had prepared the wrong locomotive and we couldn't possibly take her. It all backfired somewhat, as I then had to prepare the fire all over again on the BR Standard class. On another occasion, when working the same turn, having the correct locomotive this time, we were working the train with a Merchant Navy class. She wasn't steaming very well, and when we reached Andover, Alan decided to collect some sand from the end of the platform, and when we left, told me to throw it up onto the tube plate with the firing shovel to see if it would clear the tubes. Alan was quite a tall man, and as he opened the regulator wide open, he hit his head on the AWS bell cover, which had a protruding nut on the outside. Alan let out a yell, and there was obvious signs of a dent to the crown of his head, but luckily it didn't break the skin. The sand that I threw up on the tube plate didn't make any difference to the locomotive's steam ability either. However, when we reached Farnborough, Alan decided to try another method and leave the cut-off at 65%, which really livened the fire up. So much in fact that you could visibly see rockets of fire streaming out of the chimney. Miraculously, the steam pressure gauge moved round to the red mark, causing one of the safety valves to lift. The locomotive obviously preferred the heavy-handed treatment. During 1965, I had the pleasure of working the Cunarder on 2 occasions. This was a boat train from Waterloo to Southampton Old Docks, carrying first-class passengers. On the first occasion, Alan Gaff was my driver, and we went past to Waterloo and relieved the crew that had prepared the locomotive at Nine Elms and had already brought her to Waterloo and coupled her to the train. The locomotive was original Battle of Britain class 34064, Fighter Command, and when I looked into the firebox it was just a heap of blackness of coal, and the fire hadn't started to burn through at all. We started away, and I had to continually use the fire irons to try to rouse the fire, and didn't need to use the shovel for the first 30 miles of the journey at all. Luckily though, we didn't have to stop short of steam. My second trip with Alan Ackhurst a week later though was a totally different story. Having travelled to Nine Elms to prepare the locomotive ourselves, even having the same locomotive as the week before. We had an excellent trip. The locomotive steamed freely and we arrived at Southampton docks on time. Upon release of the train, we ran back light engine to Eastleigh Motive Power Depot, carried out disposal duties and went back home passenger to Guildford.